Good evening. I'm Barry Edelstein, Erna, Finci, Viterbi, Artistic Director of the Old Globe in San Diego, California. And I hope you're well. Hope everybody's holding up okay. Thanks for joining me for the fourth program in our series, Thinking Shakespeare Live, the Sonnets. I'm incredibly happy to have you with us tonight as we celebrate this amazing poetry and this amazing writer, William Shakespeare. Excuse me. The Old Globe believes that theater matters, and our commitment is to make it matter to more people. With our three beautiful venues in Balboa Park temporarily closed, we've shifted our operations to the digital realm, and we've turned a lot of our programming into shareable virtual celebrations of the theater. The theater's magic power is to bring strangers together and convert them into an audience, a single community. And so here we are at an appointed time and place doing just that, getting as close to the real experience of theater as we possibly can. The previous bunch of programs, our three previous episodes of the Sonnets, are available on the Globe's website and on YouTube. And now we're going to jump right in to talk about these amazing plays. Now, last week, I reached into the mailbag and just sort of brought to everybody's attention a couple of emails that I got. Last week it was about which editions of the sonnets we should read. Today I want to talk about this photo behind me, because I've gotten a bunch of emails complimenting me on this wonderful photograph behind me. And people asked, well, what is that? And so I thought I would tell you. This is a photograph called Northeast Southwest Number 1 by a wonderful California photographer named C.J. Heiliger. And you know, freelance artists and individual artists are taking such a huge hit at this moment that I'm happy to drive a little traffic CJ's way. There's his website. And he specializes in taking photos of the desert. Now, my family and I love the desert. Joshua Tree National Park is one of our favorite places. It's the first place we're going to go when all this is over. It's just magical and beautiful. The Mojave Desert, a couple of hours east of LA, a couple hours east of San Diego, just the most splendid place in the world. And so we have some desert-themed art, like this amazing photo behind me, to remind us of this place we love so much. So there you go. Those of you who are wondering, I'm a proud owner of this beautiful piece of art. Now, you're not going to believe it, but the idea of the desert reminds me of Shakespeare. Imagine that. Something reminding me of Shakespeare. Well, it doesn't take much to get me thinking about the Bard. Now, desert in Shakespeare's period meant something a little different than it means today. Today we think of a thing like that, sand and rocks and hot sun. Desert in Shakespeare's period meant any place that was not civilized, a place where there wasn't a crowd of people. So the opposite of city is desert. And there's a play called As You Like It that talks about the desert. And I want to begin our program about the sonnets there. There's a quote from As You Like It. Why should this a desert be? Because it is unpeopled? No. Tongues I'll hang on every tree that shall civil sayings show. So there is a production that we did last summer at the Old Globe of As You Like It, and the romantic young swain Orlando falls in love with this beautiful woman Rosalind, and he starts writing her love poems. And the idea here is, I'm not going to say that this deserted place, even though it's a forest full of trees and not a sandy Mojave, it's still a desert in that it's deserted. He says, I'm not going to cop to the fact that this desert is unpeopled, because I'm going to hang tongues, mouths, speaking mouths, making people out of every tree. And there you see in that photograph that he's done that. He runs around the forest putting poetry on every tree, peopling the world of this desert with poetry. It's a beautiful notion. The Duke has led his followers out to this same desert. Eventually, Orlando and Rosalind meet up with them. And the Duke asks an interesting question, too, about the desert. He says, this our life, exempt from public haunt, finds tongues in trees, books in the running brooks, sermons in stones, and good in everything. That line, this our life, exempt from public haunt. I mean, can everybody relate to that idea or not? I mean, I haven't been in a public haunt in 10 weeks. When I write my memoir, the chapter about the pandemic of 2020 is going to be called Exempt from Public Haunt. And what the Duke is saying here is that even though we may be removed from the public, even though we may be in a weird desert, we can find metaphors, we can find inspirations by looking at trees. We can look at a brook and find something, a book, we can read things there. We can look at a stone and hear a preacher giving sermons, right? We can choose through our imaginative faculties to create metaphor, to create language where there isn't much. And I just take a lot of heart from that idea because we're all stuck in the house and we go for a walk around the block. And you know what? If we want to, if we can take a page out of the Duke's book and find poetry there. Now, why am I starting a program about the sonnets with 2 lines from As You Like It? Well, it's simple. Shakespeare was a playwright. He wrote these poems, and he wrote Venus and Adonis and The Rape of Lucrece, but what he really was, first and foremost, what he is in his DNA, is a playwright. These are poems written by a dramatist. And this evening, I want to unpack that idea. How do we read poems by Shakespeare? How does the fact that he's a playwright and a dramatist influence the composition of these poems, the ideas in the poems, the structure of the poems, and the way they work? Remember that Shakespeare's plays were printed in 1623 in the first folio. His theater company gathered together all the material that had yet to be published and a bunch of plays that had already been published and brought them together in the first complete works of Shakespeare, published here, pictured here, published in 1623. Half of Shakespeare's plays had been printed during his lifetime. The other half appeared for the first time in this book, including, by the way, As You Like It. So without the first folio, we wouldn't know what the Duke and Orlando were saying about poems in the desert. But I'm going to zoom in a little bit on this image, and on the title page you see there Mr. William Shakespeare's Comedies, Histories, and Tragedies. So this book includes 3 different genres of play: comedy, history, and tragedy. Right? Let's focus for a minute on comedy and tragedy because all of us have been to the theater and we know that this symbol is the universal sign of the theater, the smiley mask and the frowning mask, comedy and tragedy, right? We go to the theater and we could see a musical comedy that makes us laugh. We could see a horrible tragedy or a deep drama that makes us sad. The masks represent 2 of the 9 Greek muses. Thalia, or Thalia, or Thalia, however you want to pronounce, is the muse of comedy, and Melpomene is the muse of tragedy. And the masks that they carried, smiling and frowning, have become the recognized symbol of theater. Well, we've focused in our study of the sonnets so far on upbeat sonnets. Sonnets 29, 18, and 91, love sonnets that are happy, that make us feel good, that brighten us. But we're giving the sonnets themselves short shrift if all we focus on is that. Because of the 154 poems, many of them are beautiful love poems, but many of them talk about the darker sides of life, the tragedy side of that complete works of Shakespeare that talks about comedies and tragedies. And I felt I wasn't being fair to this massive and extraordinary body of poetry if I only looked at the comic, bright, loving, happy ones. And so tonight I want to explore some of the shadows of the sonnets. Now remember, the sonnets are a collection of 154 poems. Their themes there you see, love and romance, and that's the positive, bright, smiley side, but also jealousy and betrayal and the pain of yearning and lust, that's the darker side. Then there's a bunch of sonnets that go into some very heavy stuff about time and how it works, and about how everything ages and eventually everything sadly dies. But the sonnet says there are some things that can resist the toxic powers of time, like love, like family, like faith, and most of all, like poetry. So let's take a dip into the aspects of the sonnets that get a little more gnarly. Here's Sonnet 147, and it gives us the other side of that love that's sort of about how much you move me and lift my heart. My love is as a fever, begins this poem. longing still for that which longer nurseth the disease. I know it's dangerous to talk about fever right now, but here we have it from Shakespeare's poetry. My love is as a fever, longing still for that which longer nurseth the disease, feeding on that which doth preserve the ill, the uncertain, sickly appetite to please. It's a pretty dark view of love, that it's a disease, that it rattles us. Here's how that poem continues, the third quatrain. Past cure I am. Now reason is past care, and frantic mad with evermore unrest. My thoughts and my discourse as madmen's are, at random from the truth, vainly expressed. So here's a vision of love that's very different from, shall I compare thee to a summer's day? This is about, my love is making me crazy. Here's another one, Sonnet 129, famous sonnet. The expense of spirit and a waste of shame is lust in action. And until action, lust is perjured, murderous, bloody, full of blame, savage, extreme, rude, cruel, not to trust. So this is a vision of lust and sexual yearning that's toxic, that's murderous, that's bloody, that's outlandish, that's savage and violent. And here's how this poem concludes. It goes on for two more quatrains about how lust is so crazy-making and so violent. And it says, all this the world well knows, yet none knows well to shun the heaven that leads men to this hell. So here are visions of love that are much, much more gnarled and painful and dark and twisted than the three sonnets that we've looked at so far. So Shakespeare's playing with tone and with theme and with the shadings and complexities and richnesses of even the brightest emotion. Now that's the love side of the sonnets, the comedy side. Now we get into an even darker side of the sonnets, right? The side that really, really goes for the sort of most sort of wrenching and black part of the human experience. Now we know Shakespeare's tragic vision is intense. There's King Lear, the brilliant Robert Foxworth playing the title role at the Globe with the body of his loving dead daughter Cordelia in his arms. If there's a more terrible tragic vision in human literature, it's hard to think what it might be. Othello, yet another guy holding yet another dead woman at the end of the play. The stage is strewn with corpses at the end of Othello. There's the great Blair Underwood holding Kristen Connolly dead in his arms at the end of my production of the play a couple of years ago. Hamlet. Is there any play that's more obsessed with death? There's the melancholy Dane in a famous icon staring at a skull. So now we get into that part of the sonnets, and here's one of the most chilling, Sonnet 73. It's a vision of old age and proximity to death that's really kind of scary. That time of year thou mayst in me behold, when yellow leaves, or none or few, do hang upon those boughs which shake against the cold, bare ruined choirs where late the sweet birds sang. So it's a vision of old age that's like a winter tree denuded of its leaves. And that image is like the benches in a church where the choir usually sits that are empty, just like the birds are no longer in the boughs of the wintry tree. It's just a terrible vision of the truth of old age and looming demise, dark and difficult, just like King Lear and Othello and Hamlet. Here's another one, Sonnet 64. When I have seen by time's fell hand defaced the rich proud cost of outworn buried age, when sometime lofty towers I see down raised, and brass eternal slave to mortal rage. So this quatrain is saying, well, when I think about how time damages everything, the beautiful fancy things from the old days, when I think about how sometimes giant towers fall down, you know, I lived in New York City on September 11th, 2001, and everybody had this line on their mind, when sometime lofty towers I see down raised, and brass eternal slave to mortal rage. And here's how this poem continues. It's this catalog of how time destroys everything, and it reminds the poet of ruin. Ruin hath taught me thus to ruminate, that time will come and take my love away. This thought is as a death. which cannot choose but weep to have that which it fears to lose. So the poem is about how when I think about time destroying everything, it makes me meditate on ruin, and it reminds me that the people that I love are going to die, and it makes me cry that I love people who one day are going to die. It's just an amazingly dark, dense, complicated vision. So there's this idea of the many genres of Shakespeare reflected in this collection of poems. But there's another genre of Shakespeare's plays. So I'm not going to stay in death. I mean, I understand you must think, Barry, why are you coming into our living room in the middle of a pandemic to talk about death? I get it. You're right. When the Globe reopens, you know, the first play we're going to do is a new musical called Cotton Candy. And then we're going to do a one-man review called Sing, Dance, Laugh. And then finally, we're going to do an old play from the 30s called Fluffy Bunnies, because, you know, enough with sickness and enough with the dark side of life. Let's laugh a little bit. Although, let's also remember Aristotle's prescription, you have to have catharsis. We've all been dealing with so much grief that the theater, when we come back, will put tragedy on and give us that place to exercise our grief and get our emotions out. But Shakespeare didn't stop there. He wrote comedies, he wrote tragedies, but what the people who put the folio together did not list is the fourth genre, a genre that Shakespeare pretty much invented at the end of his writing life, where he took comedy and tragedy and mashed them together. And these plays, the critics typically call the romances or the tragic comedies. Some people just say, well, they come at the end of Shakespeare's writing career. They're called the late plays. The late plays are Pericles, Prince of Tyre. There's a production the Old Globe's MFA students did some time ago. Cymbeline, which the Globe hasn't done in so long that the only production photos we have are for when people still did them in black and white. We don't even have any color photos of Cymbeline. We got to do that play again, one of my favorites. The Winter's Tale, my very favorite Shakespeare play, and the first play I directed at the Globe, one of the romances, one of the late plays. And of course, The Tempest, one of Shakespeare's masterpieces. There's a production I directed in Los Angeles at the Walt Disney Concert Hall. These four plays are in some ways the culmination of Shakespeare's career. Some might argue Hamlet is a greater play, King Lear is a greater play, but these four plays do something with the form of drama itself, mixing genres together. In these plays, dead people come back to life. In these plays, families that have been sundered come miraculously back together. People who do horrible things get second chances to make amends. These plays mix comedy and clowning with serious, serious tragedy. Gods show up in these plays to set human affairs right. They are a vision of human darkness redeemed. Human darkness turned around, human mistakes made right, human beings given a chance to dig themselves out of the darkest, densest, most ugly things. I think that these four plays are going to be the Shakespeare plays that everybody produces when we recover from this terrible period in our history, because they give us a way forward. They say, yes, losses happened, grief happened, but there are ways to turn that around. There are ways to redeem them, and that's what I want to talk about in these sonnets tonight. Those sonnets that acknowledge the darker side of the human situation, but give us a way forward, welcome us some forward path toward redemption. They do that through love. They do that through poetry, through art. They do that through hope. They do that through imagination. These are the ideas that I want to explore tonight. Love and art, hope and imagination, and that's how we move forward from the deep depredations, disturbances of the human experience. The miserable have no other medicine but only hope, Shakespeare tells us in his play Measure for Measure. What a great line for right now. The miserable have no other medicine but only hope. You don't need remdesivir. You don't need hydroxychloroquine. And God knows you don't need a big glass of Clorox. But what you do need is hope. The miserable have no other medicine but only hope. And then there's another big idea in Shakespeare that connects to these sonnets. One of my favorite lines in all of Shakespeare. Much virtue in if. The idea if, that we can imagine a different way. If, when the world comes back, it's more gentle. If only when the world comes back, it's more just. Can we imagine what it would be like if we could live together, if we could make a society that functions better? This is what Shakespeare offers to us, the imaginative human act of conjuring a better way. Much virtue in if. We have it in us to see something different, if only we'll be brave enough to try. The sonnets have 14 lines. They are organized into groups, 3 quatrains and a couplet, 3 groups of 4, that's a quatrain, and then a couplet, which is a group of 2. The sonnets have a rhyme scheme, which alternates. Here are the rhymes from last week's sonnet: skill, force, ill, horse. Me, cost, be, boast, near rhyme, pleasure, rest, measure, best, take, make. So each quatrain, the last word in the line, rhymes alternating. So the first and third lines of the quatrains rhyme, the second and fourth lines of the quatrains rhyme. The sonnets are written in iambic pentameter, otherwise known as blank verse. What that means is that there are units of 2 syllables. Excuse me, that's an iamb. So didum is an iamb. First syllable is unstressed, second syllable is stressed. You put 5 of them penta together and you get didum, 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 didum. That's iambic pentameter. That's the basic rhythm of the verse line in Shakespeare. Didum, 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 didum. And we'll see that every line is written that way. Finally, each one of the sonnets has a turn, or a volta in Italian, when the argument that the sonnet makes turns in a different direction. So, wow, this stay-at-home thing is getting very, very trying, but I really love all the time I'm getting with my kids. That's a turn. I'm going in one direction, and then I make a volta, and I go back in another. So I'm going to jump in now to a bonus sonnet. Tonight, we're not going to get just 1, but 2 sonnets. The second one you'll get a chance to do. The first one I'm going to take us through. And these are sonnets in which Shakespeare takes us to a place that's painful, that's challenging, that's dark, but then through hope, through imagination, through if, he lifts us back out. So we're going to start with Sonnet 60. One of my real favorites by Shakespeare. Okay, I'm going to go through like we always do, 1 line at a time, tell you what it means, then we'll put it all together. Like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end. So there's a simile that says, just in the way that the waves in the ocean crash in on the shore, that's the way our minutes go quickly, hasten toward their end. Pebbled shore, those of us who live in San Diego, we have sandy shores. We don't have pebbled shores. But in England, where Shakespeare was writing, the shores are rocky and pebbled. So he's saying that our life is like the relentlessness of the waves pummeling the shore. Like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end, each changing place with that which goes before. In sequent toil, all forwards do contend. So in sequential hard work, that's how life moves forward. It's a pretty dark vision of our minutes marching not toward their beauty, not toward their redemption, but toward their end. And it's hard work, sequent toil. That's how time marches forward. Nativity, once in the main of light. So nativity, birth, like a nativity scene at Christmas. Birth, once in the main of light. Main there means like a vast expanse. We still talk about the ocean as a bounding main. So it means birth, which was once illuminated by a vast expanse of light, crawls toward maturity. So there's that toiling march of time. Birth crawls toward maturity. We crawl our way towards being old. Wherewith being crowned, when we're crowned with maturity, crooked eclipses against his glory fight. That's a complicated idea. Eclipses fight against our glory once we get old. An eclipse is like an eclipse of the sun or the moon. Elizabethans, Jacobeans were very superstitious and believed in astrology, and they believed that the stars had impact on our life. So crooked eclipses, malign, angry astrology fights against our glory as we get old. And time that gave doth now his gift confound. So time brought us to life. Time gave us opportunity, but now as we're old, it's going to confound that gift. Now you see already we've got the rhyme scheme: shore, end, before, contend, light, crowned, fight, confound. It's iambic pentameter, like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end. Now we go into the third quatrain when we learn more about time. Time doth transfix the flourish set on youth. The flourish set on youth is sort of the beautiful shape that young people have, the lineaments of their body, the glory of their personal self. But time transfixes it. Doesn't mean freeze the way we use transfix. It means to pierce. So time has a knife or a dagger or a scythe and pierces through the beauty of youth and delves the parallels in beauty's brow. Right here you go, some parallels in a brow right there, delved by time, right? So time digs parallel trenches in our brow, not beautiful, just the parallels. Feeds on the rarities of nature's truth. So time eats the most beautiful things, the rarities that nature in its integrity has created, and nothing stands but for his scythe to mow. So here's an image of life as a relentless slog towards its end, of age being decay. Crooked eclipses even were stooped, were crooked in the shape of old, bent over. And this terrible sense that there's nothing that can withstand time. But remember I said there's redemption coming. There's the tragic comedy, there's the mixed genre, and here comes the couplet, and here comes the volta, not on line 9, but on line 13. And yet, to times in hope, my verse shall stand, praising thy worth despite his cruel hand. So, this dark vision of time, and yet, hope is going to withstand it in the form of my verse. I'm going to create art. I'm going to make poetry. And that's going to give us hope. And I'm going to praise you because you're worthy of it. And the heck with time. I don't care how cruel his hand is. Cruel there has 2 syllables. Praising thy worth despite his cruel hand. It's wonderful that cruel has 2 syllables. It makes it even worse. Praising thy worth despite his cruel hand. So there's Sonnet 60, this twist on genre that I was talking about, this darkness mixed with something that lifts us out. That couplet at the end is so beautiful. And yet to times in hope my verse shall stand. The miserable have no other medicine but only hope. Time is so challenging. Time is so difficult. But if we have hope and if we make art, then maybe we'll get out of it. Okay, here comes the second sonnet that we're going to look at. We're going to go back earlier in the sequence, Sonnet 30. And again, I'm going to go through one line at a time. Pay attention, because you're going to do this one after I'm done. When to the sessions of sweet, silent thought, I summon up remembrance of things past. There's a famous line, remembrance of things past. So when I meditate, when I sit down for a session of quiet thought that's sweet, I remember things from my past. When I sit down to meditate, I remember my past. I sigh the lack of many a thing I sought. I sigh because, God, I wanted that career, or I wanted that love, or I wanted that house, or I wanted that experience. And with old woes, new wail my dear time's waste. And when I'm sitting and meditating, I think about old sadnesses from the past, and I wail over them as if they're new, as I think of the waste of my life, the expense of my life. Second quatrain. Then can I drown an eye unused to flow, so I can start to cry, even though I'm not much of a crier. I'm not much of a crier. Well, not me, I'm the world's biggest crier, but the poet is saying I'm not much of a crier, but nonetheless, when I think these thoughts, then I can drown my eye. What for? For precious friends hid in death's dateless night. So then I start to cry over my dear friends who've died, and weep afresh love's long since cancelled woe. So I start to cry again over a heartbreak that happened a long time ago, about a breakup that was forever ago, but I cry again about it. and moan the expense of many a vanished sight. This always reminds me of my friends in New York who were old-timers who would say, oh, they knocked down Penn Station, and they would moan the expense of many a vanished sight. Oh, how could they tear down Penn Station? And I think about that, and I moan, and I weep. Then can I grieve at grievances forgone? I can feel fresh grief over grievances, over things, bad things that happened to me a long time ago. And heavily from woe to woe tell o'er the sad account of fore bemoaned moan. So I can heavily feel woe over sad reckonings that I moaned about before, which I knew pay, as if not paid before. So here we have 3 quatrains saying, hey, look, when I sit down to meditate, I can think about my past, and then I remember all the things I didn't have, and I start to cry over my friends that were dead, and I start to cry over pain that happened in my past, and I go over in my mind all the terrible things as if it happened right now. Now, take a look at some of this language. Sessions, summon, canceled, expense, tell o'er the sad account. Tell means count, like a teller in a bank, to count up an amount. So it's interesting here that the losses are expressed clearly enough as personal things, but the imagery is of legal matters and business and finance. So in a deep way, the poem is connecting financial loss with emotional loss. I mean, is there a more apt poem for this moment that we're living through, where our financial losses, our economic hardships are connected, are deeply intertwined with the emotional pain that we're feeling? So here again, 3 quatrains that bring us to this deep place of sadness. And guess what's coming next? The volta. But if, there's that much virtue in if the while I think on thee, dear friend, all losses are restored and sorrows end. So if makes it magic. If lifts us out of that pain. We can descend into all the sadnesses of our lives, but there is a way to get out of it, which is to think about you. If the while I think on thee, dear friend, all losses are restored and sorrows end. Much virtue in if. And remember what Hamlet tells us. There's nothing either good or bad, but thinking makes it so. We can decide how we want to go through our lives and decide whether we want to think of things in a way that's dark or in a way that's light. In the smiling mask of Talia or in the frowning mask of Melpomene, as a comedy or as a tragedy. If we want, we can change our thoughts and think about matters in a different way. Okay, now let's talk about some of this language before you get your turn. Remember, we always work through our Shakespeare one line at a time. Take a piece of paper, cover up the text, read one line, pull the paper down, that hand, right? Which is in front? This one. Okay, read one line, pull it down again, read another line, go one line at a time. And here's what happens. At the end of each line, there's an opportunity to think up what comes next. And heavily from woe to woe tell o'er what? The sad account of fore bemoaned moan. So at the end of that line of iambic pentameter, there's a little opportunity to think what comes next. Verbs we've talked about before, very important. Summon, sigh, sought, moan, vanished, grieve, forgone, tell, bemoaned, pay, paid, think, restored, end. And all the juice and actions in these verbs. Remember, we use verbs in the form of adjectives. We use verbs in the form of gerunds. Any form that verbs take, we use them. Circle those verbs. When you pick up a piece of Shakespeare, the language will come roaring to life. Antithesis, opposition, big idea. Here's where Shakespeare, the playwright, comes into his poetry, because plays are about conflict, about two ideas banging up against each other. And you hear it in this poem. I sigh, I sought. Old woes, new wail. Afresh, canceled. New pay, not paid. Restored, end. So antithesis, right? Underline these antitheses, circle your verbs, make a little line at the end of each line, just a few items from Staples and you're good to go. And then some special language, how the language isn't always highly wrought and blah, 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 Shakespearean. Sometimes it's straightforward and simple, and we have to look at the special things that language does. Here in this poem, we have, and in number 60, assonance. Assonance is the repetition of a vowel sound in a series of words in a line of poetry. Not rhyming, but taking a vowel sound and repeating it. That's assonance. So, delves the parallels in beauty's brow, that repeated or I sigh the lack of many a thing I sought. Then can I drown an I, unused to flow, that I. And then at the end of Sonnet 30, and heavily from woe to woe, tell o'er the sad account of for bemoaned moan. And we hear these the grief that the poem is talking about is communicated musically through the repetition of these vowels using the literary device of assonance. Here's a famous example from Hamlet: to die, to sleep, perchance to dream. Aye, there's the rub. Those E sounds, that's assonance. Abutted consonants, interesting, big idea for actors. Actors love this one, abutted consonants. It means when one word ends in the same consonant that begins the second word. So those two consonants are butted up against each other. They are abutted. In sequent toil, all four words do contend. A T at the end of sequent and the T at the beginning of toil. New whale, the W's there are abutted up against each other, and all losses. Now, it's easy to simply say, in sequent toil, all four words do contend. And with old woes, new whale, my dear time's waste, all losses are restored and sorrows end, and connect them up. But when you see a really well-trained Shakespearean actor, they won't connect them up, they'll separate them. In sequent toil, all four words do contend. Separating the consonants makes that second word special. And with old woes, new wail, my dear time's waste, all losses are restored. Right? So those are abutted consonants. Some actors don't like separating them, some do. Here's a famous example from Shakespeare's Richard II. That's Robert Sean Leonard playing the title role at the Globe a couple of years ago. For God's sake, let us sit upon the ground and tell sad stories of the death of kings. So separating those abutted consonants makes some special spark fly in that line. And finally, the Irene Worth rule. Now, Irene Worth was a great American-born, but then British professionally, moved to England and became incredibly famous, one of the great stage actors of the 20th century, one of the great classical actors of the 20th century, one of the greatest Shakespeareans of all time. Irene Worth, there she is on the right, playing Goneril in the famous Peter Brook film of King Lear opposite Paul Scofield. Well, once upon a time, I did a benefit in New York for a theater company where a bunch of celebrities came and read sonnets. And Irene Worth was one, and oh my God, it was like meeting royalty. I couldn't believe she was there in the room, this amazing, elegant, classy lady. Some young guy got Sonnet 60 to read. I can't remember who the actor was, some young movie star guy, and said, this line, let me get you there to it. In sequent toil, all four words do contend. He was just sitting there reading, and he said, in sequent toil, all four words do contend. And Irene Worth suddenly said, excuse me, young man, may I just please always stress the word all. And I call that the Irene Worth rule. Always stress the word all. Now, it helps if you have her voice and her majesty and her presence. But she said, always stress the word all. That's a good advice in Shakespeare wherever you hit it. In sequent toil, all. Oh, I didn't separate my abutted consonants. In sequent toil, all four words do contend. Or at the end of Sonnet 30, all losses are restored and sorrows end. Always stress the word all. Here's the most famous alls in Shakespeare. All the world's a stage, and all the men and women merely players, right? There's juice in that word all. So we're thinking of you tonight, Irene Worth. Okay, so we're going to take a look at Sonnet 30. by William Shakespeare. I'm going to put the lines up one at a time, and you are going to let yourself go to that place where we're all feeling now about remembering things in our past, the sadnesses of this moment, the sadnesses earlier in our lives, and then that redemption, that second chance, that way of climbing out of it through love, through thinking, and through if. Here we go. When to the sessions of sweet, silent thought I summon up remembrance of things past, I sigh the lack of many a thing I sought, and with old woes new wail my dear time's waste. Then can I drown an eye unused to flow for precious friends hid in death's dateless night, and weep afresh love's long since cancelled woe, and moan the expense of many a vanished sight. Then can I grieve at grievances forgone, and heavily from woe to woe tell o'er the sad account of forebemoaned moan, which I new pay as if not paid before. But if the while I think on thee, dear friend, all losses are restored and sorrows end. It's so beautiful to have that dark cloud lift through if and through thinking and through love. And this is the gift of Shakespeare's romantic vision, Shakespeare's tragicomic vision, and the vision that infuses the sonnets. You can send me an email at hibarry@theoldglobe.org. I'd love to hear from you. Hey, Thursday night, the Globe has commissioned a world premiere play to be performed in Zoom. A Zoom play, my God. And it's going to be live at the Old Globe's website Thursday, May 14th at 6:30. The great Bill Irwin, the greatest ever clown and one of the great actors in the American theater, has written and is performing this wonderful play with the Broadway star Christopher Fitzgerald live from the Old Globe on Thursday the 14th. Next Tuesday, a week from tonight, I'm doing my Thinking Shakespeare Live program, which is how actors and directors work on this language in the stage, with Grantham Coleman, who played Hamlet at the Globe, Megan Ketch, who was in Double Indemnity at the Globe, and Richard Thomas, one of the finest classical actors in America, and little old me. So that's Tuesday, May 19th at 6:30 right here on the Globe's Facebook page. Hey, visit our website, would you please, and check out our Globe Rising page. If you like the work that we're doing, our arts engagement work, our humanities work, and this series, wow, we sure would appreciate a little contribution to help keep the Globe, and most important, its wonderful people intact until that happy day we can reopen. We'll be performing Shakespeare's plays again soon for you to come and see. And we're going to keep up with the sonnets. And I urge you, take a look at 60, take a look at 30 tonight. Read all 154 of them. They're wonderful. And we'll see you next time. Don't panic. Be brave. Take care of yourself. Take care of each other. Thanks so much.